Old-time gray here. I bought a old air grinder, air sander, Allen Air, made in St. Louis, Missouri, on eBay. Got it for like 40 bucks, including shipping, which ain't bad. But check this out. Sounds fine. Sounds fine. Freewheeling. But as soon as I put load on it, it just stops. So let's fix it. First thing's removing the disc. And this just uses a drift or a piece of rod or something. And you just wind it off. Second thing, remove the air fitting. Next comes this little roll pin that holds the trigger assembly in. I just take my old tinner's hammer. There's the roll pin. And out comes the trigger valve and spring. And there's an O-ring on there that you can see that looks pretty chewed up. Then with the wrench or the sander still clamped in the vise, I'm going to take a skinny wrench, very skinny wrench, and I'm going to take the main motor assembly loose by backing out this nut. Backing out this nut. Then I'm going to take a dead blow hammer, plastic faces on it. I'm going to hold it by the spindle, by the motor spindle, and just give it a couple of gentle whacks to persuade it to come apart. Like so. And there's the motor assembly. And there's an O-ring on there that looks pretty beat up. Okay, so that's probably why it's leaking. So that's going to get replaced. And there's one more O-ring buried down in the trigger pocket. You can see I pulled an edge of it out. It looks crimped. I think this was our culprit. The edge of that is crimped. Okay. What's left here is just a motor, just the casting. Nothing else to it, so I'm just going to clean that up with some soap and water. Bearing's got a little bit of rust on it, but not too bad. Seems to turn okay. But to disassemble the motor, I'm just going to take the dead blow hammer and just give it a few love taps. Now to finish the job, I'm just going to take a punch and align it in the little pilot hole in the main shaft. Just hold it with my fingers, and I'm not holding it, not touching the bench. I'm just doing this in midair. I'm going to take my tinner's hammer and just. Okay, you got 4 wipers or paddles that fit in these slots. And there's 2 little shims that go on the back. Don't lose those. You have the little motor housing itself. It's eccentric, as you can see, with the O-ring on it. We'll pry that out of there just with our fingernails. We'll replace that. And you've got the rotor and the front bearing and the chuck. I'll pull these apart. To remove the chuck, I'm going to clamp the little flat spots on the main shaft in a pair of soft jaws. And I'm going to take 2 punches and stick them in the lock holes, and just, oh, it came easy, and just unthread it. Here's the nut. that holds the front of the housing. I mean, goes on the front of the motor. And there is the front bearing. To disassemble the front bearing, I'm just gonna hold it in my hands. It's just very lightly pressed and just give it a little love tap. And there's a couple spacers on here. Don't lose those. There you go. There's the main shaft. To remove the front bearing from the carrier, I'm just going to take a little socket. Again, I'm just holding it in my hands. This is a really delicate aluminum die casting. You don't want to be beaten up on it. So I'm just going to hold this in my hands and then just, again, give it a little love tap. Or two. And out pops the bearing. And then here's the front bearing carrier. Same for the rear bearing carrier, just a socket, holding it in my hands, and just a couple gentle taps, and out pops the rear bearing. Yeah, it works pretty good. To disassemble the trigger, I'm just gonna see if I can get a close up on this. I'm just gonna unwind the spring out of its land. So there's the spring. And then there's another O-ring right there. I'm gonna roll that off. Like that. Now to begin reassembly. So I'm going to start by replacing the front bearing and the little bearing carrier. I just set it in there. I'm just going to take the dead blow hammer and tap her in place. Rear bearing, I'm going to do the same thing. Front bearing's open, rear bearing sealed. Now I'm going to reassemble the little trigger assembly. So just one of the O-rings, got a brand new 1/2 inch O-ring. That goes in this gland right here, like that. Little teeny weeny O-ring goes under here. Like that, and then wind the spring back on. Like that. So there's the assembled trigger, and then the second 1/2 inch O-ring goes on the back, sitting on that gland right there. Now to reassemble the rotor, I'm just going to use a little 1/2 inch socket as a stand. First thing I'm going to do is put on the little spacers so I don't forget them. There were 2 of these. Like so. And then the front bearing support, bearing carrier, which has got a little pin on it. So that's going to go on. And that just presses on. And then I'm going to invert the motor rotor assembly into the socket like that. And I can reload the little paddles one by one. And then I can slip over the motor housing, which I marked for the front, and align the little pin with the little hole. Like that. And then I can replace the rear bearing carrier, which does not have a pin. Spacers for the rear bearing go on. like that. And then the rear bearing carrier gets pressed on. And for that, I'm just going to tap it on with a 1/2-inch socket. Before I lose it, I'm going to install the trigger housing into the trigger assembly into the handle housing. Just going to lube up the O-rings with a little bit of Hoppy's number 9. Push her in there like that. And then seat the roll pin. And on goes the outer O-ring. Just roll that over everything into the gland, like so. I'll put a little bit of lubricant on things here. And slide her back into the motor housing. Like so. Okay, just seating everything good and tight with my fingers. And then on goes the retention nut. That's going to give that another little love tap to make sure everything's seated. And then just snug her down. And then on goes the chuck. And this will self-torque, self-tighten when you fire it up the first time. A little scrap of Teflon tape. Seal up the threads. Give her a whirl. That sounds a lot stronger already. All right, let's try it out. Let's get fit her up with I use an old rundown cutoff wheel for a backing plate and a cut down 4-inch sanding disc. Just a scrap of pipe, and remember before she wouldn't grind at all. So here we go. That's a success. It's a piece of 24 grit. It's a little bit rough for aluminum, but it's cobby looking aluminum weld. I'm just going to try it on that for the hell of it. So a little bit of Irish spring on the sanding disc. Oh yeah, and there we have it. One restored, refreshed air sander. Obviously that bum O-ring was the problem. Now it's working fine. So this baby's going back into service, and it's on to the next project. I'll see you there and then.